talked about the European reaction to their discovery of this ancient Indian civilization. And I just want to read one more quote on that. This is from Sir William Jones, the person who discovered that the Sanskrit language was cognate with, was part of the same language family as practically all the European languages. And so at that time, most people accepted the creation story of the Bible as the history of the world. For example, the sort of in Europe, the explanation of why there are different languages in the world was the Tower of Babel. And so Sir William Jones said that either the first chapters of Genesis are true, and of course, according, by that time in Europe, they had calculated exactly how old the earth was according to Genesis. And there's still some of that today, that sort of creationism. You may have heard of that, sort of creationism fighting against evolution. But back then, that was mainstream. That was the mainstream position of Europe. Creationism, a very short history of the earth. So Jones said, he was a very learned man, very, very learned man, and the governor of East India. Either the first chapters of Genesis are true, or the whole fabric of our national religion is wrong. And this was like, a little too shocking for them. And arguments principally founded on the high assumptions of the Brahmins, this great antiquity of the earth and this great antiquity of the Vedic civilization. So these arguments on the high assumptions of the Brahmins, could their extravagant claims be substantiated, have a direct tendency to overturn the Mosaic system, Moses, and with it, Christianity. So Europe saw that its entire culture, its entire sacred culture, was threatened by this Vedic version of the world. So there was something at stake here. Anyway, so what was this Vedic culture? First of all, we call it Vedic culture because it's based on some very ancient literature called the Vedas. And according to linguistic analysis, there are different strata of literature, just like we do geology. There's different levels of the earth, older, younger, etc. So the oldest are called the Samhita. The word Samhita just means a collection. And there are 4 Vedas, basically. So sometimes the word Veda refers to this oldest strata of literature. The Rig Veda, Samaveda, Yajnatarva, must be in your book. And so these are 4 hymns. I mean, maybe if we have time, we'll talk about exactly what they are. The oldest being the Rig Veda. Now, there was kind of, how should I put it? These 4 Vedas were protected and studied and taught within Brahminical communities. We talked last time about the social system. The Brahmins were the priests and the teachers, then the Kshatriyas, the warriors, princes, the nobility, the governors, the Vaishyas, basically people, the productive class, farmers, traders, and so on, and the Shudras, the workers. So there were different Brahmin families, extended families. Extended families get very extended, actually, especially when they intermarry. So there were different extended Brahmin families who were, so to speak, the proprietors, the caretakers, the guardians of different Vedas. So each one of these 4 Vedas had their own lineage of commentaries. And so there's a class of literature called the Brahmin literature. This doesn't refer to the social class. This is a genre of literature. So each Veda, Rig, Sama, Yajna, and Tarva, had its own Brahmin literature, kind of shop talk. Brahmins talking to Brahmins about the rituals. Now, these Vedas are all about fire sacrifice. Fire sacrifice was practically the universal religion of the earth in ancient times. If you study the ancient Greek culture and Homer, it's all about fire sacrifice. If you read the Odyssey by Homer, when Odysseus is trying to get home to Ithaca, right? Cornell, Ithaca. Anyway, that's an island sort of, it's on the west coast of the main Greek peninsula. Anyway, so on the way back, he keeps stopping at different islands, having adventures, and no one eats, or, this is the point, in Homer, in the Iliad also, no one eats or drinks anything until they've offered the food or drink in sacrifice to the gods. It's considered uncivilized, barbaric. It's almost like it's like shoplifting. If you go into a store and just start shoving some food in your face and don't pay for it and walk out, it's considered criminal. That's how people in ancient times understood the way life works. That food and rain and so on, these are gifts. just very quickly, one very dramatic scene in the Iliad by Homer. Hector, the great Trojan. Anyway, I'm from Southern California, so we have a different kind of Trojan there. But anyway, so in this battle between the Trojans and the Greeks, Hector is the Trojan hero. And so he comes back in within the city walls one day after fighting. After fighting all day, he's covered with blood and dirt. He's been fighting all day, killing people and so on. And so his mother sees him like that, wounded, exhausted. And so she says to one of the palace servants, go offer a drink and then bring it to him. In other words, even when your son comes home after fighting all day, risking his life, is exhausted, wounded, he can't drink anything until it's offered to the gods. So we're going to talk about the sacrifices, but that's what the Vedas are about. They're about fire sacrifice. Also, if you study the ancient Persian culture, it's all about fire sacrifice, all over the world practically, also in pagan Europe. So you have the Brahmin literature which talks about the fire sacrifice, like what does it mean and why do we do it, and how should you do it, and so on. Now, these rituals generally were meant to guarantee human prosperity and also human prosperity in the next life. That if we do sacrifices, we'll live well in this life, and in the next life we'll be promoted to even a higher world. There are some people who are not satisfied just doing rituals. They want to understand what is life all about. Like, why are we doing these sacrifices? And rather than merely try to enjoy the world, what is the world, and who are we, and where do we come from, and who set up the system, and so on and so forth. So at that point, people become interested in knowledge, that the goal of life is not just to sort of pay your cosmic utility bills and guarantee that the lights will stay on, the sun will shine, the rain will fall, the crops will grow, everybody's happy. But apart from that, where does it all come from? Wisdom, knowledge. So there's a class of literature called the Aranyaka literature. It's a long A in Sanskrit. The word Aranya means forest. So literally this means the forest books, because what happened is some people stayed in the towns or the, you could say the urban centers, cultural centers where there were Brahmins and all kinds of priestly rituals and so on. But some people started going out to the wilderness, sort of a back to nature, an ancient back to nature movement. They wanted to get away from all these rituals and think and meditate and try to figure out what life is all about. So this Aranyaka literature is from those people who are trying to figure out what is this really all about. Now, these literatures are still very ritualistic. It's not that these people gave up the rituals, but they're starting to think about them more. And then finally to get a class of literature which is sort of explicitly philosophical or mystical and trying to understand what life is really all about, and that's called the Upanishads. So in general, there was a movement called a Shramana movement back in ancient times. We're talking now, as far as the dates, well, depends on where you stand in the great culture war over the early history of India. Within the tradition, this is many, many thousands of years old or older. And then sometimes Western scholars, again, starting with a tradition that didn't want to contradict the Genesis story, made it much later. But in any case, it's very, very ancient. And the Upanishads, the early Upanishads, yes? You have a question? Okay, the early Upanishads probably started around 3,000 years ago at the latest, and probably much earlier, yes?
Were these fire sacrifices, were they performed as a community or individually? Did you have to be like a priest?
Okay, there were domestic rites described in books called the Griya Sutras, where every Brahminical family, and more or less every higher class family, would keep a fire going in their own home and make daily offerings called Agnihotra. Then there were what are called solemn rituals, like great rites, state rituals, where they were great state events, where there would be great sacrifices, everyone would come, there would be a huge distribution of charity, and it was actually an important part of the economy which the government gave back to people that needed. And so and that's called the Shrota rituals. So the great state rituals patronized by a king or noble, and then there were the home rituals, which were on a much smaller scale.
So most families would keep a fire continuously?
Yeah, at least the higher class families would keep a fire burning. Yes.
Can you, maybe this is off topic, I was wondering about the Agnihotra ceremony, because I saw it performed like multiple times.
Right. Well, we're going to get to a little more a description of sacrifice.
Okay.
So if you can just kind of hang in there. Okay. So, so anyway, so here you have it. These literatures, including part of the Aranyakas, were basically in Sanskrit jargon. That's called karma. Not karma in the sense like, you know, your good or bad karma, but karma in the sense of ritual. The word karma, by the way, is from a Sanskrit root, kri, which means to, well, to make or to do. Related to this word in English, because it's part of the same language family, we have words like create and increase. So this kri here is the same kri. So anyway, that's the root of the word karma. It simply means action. And it also stands for this whole ritual dimension of the culture. And then the knowledge dimension of the culture is called jnana, this word, or gyan, which is cognate with the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge, which we still have in English, like someone who, let's say, is, well, not knowledgeable, ignorant, right? We still have words like ignorant and agnostic. So these words are all cognate with the Sanskrit, with this pronounced, the written in J sort of mostly pronounced gyan. Anyway, so that's the knowledge portion of the culture. So the Shramana movement, show you I have not completely incoherent here. The Shramana thing, Shramana literally means kind of like really exerting yourself, exhausting yourself. And there was a tendency for some people to start to go out to the country, out to the wilderness. And because the ritual culture was kind of getting out of control at a certain point. It was sort of like too much ritual. And the rituals were starting to become violent. They were starting to do a lot of animal sacrifices. It sort of became an ancient Vedic kosher industry. And so some people objected to the violence of the animal sacrifices. They objected to what they considered to be the sort of ritual materialism of the karma thing. Yes?
I'm sorry, what did you say that it meant?
Oh, karma. Which word? Oh, shramana. Sorry. Shramana sort of means knocking yourself out. I mean, literally, it means sort of like working real hard at something, like tiring yourself, because they would go out to the wilderness and perform austerities and emaciate their bodies and things like that. It's like a yoga thing. So this Shramana movement, people sort of starting to revolt against, and this has to do with the paper topic, that dialectic thing, where you have a Vedic culture which was mostly focused on ritual, and then there tended to be a reaction against this from reaction from thinking people who didn't like the violence of animal sacrifice, didn't like the materialism of just doing rituals to get material rewards, and wanted to really think about things and get to a higher spiritual plane. So some of the people who were inclined that way stayed within the Vedic fold, and they were the ones who concerned themselves with the Upanishads and yoga and things like that. There was another group that kind of jumped ship. They bailed. They kind of wanted to get away from the whole Vedic culture, and they started to create their own traditions, the most famous of which, we're going to talk about one on Wednesday, the Jain tradition, and the most famous of these Shramana movements that bolted from Vedic culture is, of course, Buddhism, which started in India. And we'll talk all about that, how Buddhism was part of this general Shramana thing that was going on, to, back to nature, simple life, spiritual, wisdom, sort of tone down the rituals. So that's it. Now, as far as this culture, because Europeans, for various personal agendas, wanted the ancient Vedic people to come from somewhere else, preferably Europe, or if not Europe, they decided to split the difference. They can come from Central Asia, which is halfway between Europe and India. Those are the liberal people, the compromise. So because they needed the Vedic people to migrate, they claimed that in the Vedas, if you look at the Rig Veda, the oldest literature, what we see is the nomadic people. The problem with that is they're not so nomadic. For example, one of the most common epithets of Indra, Zeus, Indra, the rain god, thunder god, head of the gods, one of the most common names for him is Purandara, which means the one who shatters the cities of the enemies. And there are descriptions in the oldest book, the Rig Veda, of palaces with 1,000 pillars. There are discussions of ships at sea and chariots, which obviously require road building. And also there's an extremely sophisticated literature, an intellectual culture. So the idea that sort of nomadic, semi-nomadic people wandering around herding sheep come up with extremely sophisticated literature and concepts of ships at sea and palaces, and things like that is, I think, a stretch. So suffice it to say, it looks like the ancient Vedic culture, there were some urban developments, and there was a lot of, it was mostly rural and agricultural, or, raising different kinds of animals. Yes?
Who like coined like the term like Aryan? Like what did Indians?
Oh, okay.
Indians call their past?
Yeah, the word Arya. In Sanskrit, the word is Arya. It's in the Rig Veda, and it means a noble person, an educated person, or a respectable person. That's what the word originally meant. And so it's a common word in Sanskrit, Arya. Mm-hmm.
Where Iranians get the word Aryan from?
Well, the ancient Persia, the ancient Persian language, the Avestan language of the Zoroastrian culture is actually a dialect of Vedic Sanskrit. And also is based on fire. So for example, the god of the ancient Persian religion, Ahura Mazda, the word Ahura, well, I'll show you very quickly, try to get all this in. There's a ancient Sanskrit word asu, which means the vital breath, the breath of life, and also comes to mean the soul. And so from that, there's an ancient word, asura, which can mean a godly person, not to be confused, if any of you know about this stuff, with another word, asura, which means not a sura, not a godly person, in other words, a demon. This is different than the word asura. And in Persia, they pronounce the S like an H, so this became Ahura Mazda. And that's also like the Sindhu is an ancient river, name for a river that divided Persia and India. And so they pronounce, in the Persian side, they pronounce this word Hindu. And you can guess the rest. So, anyway, so back to our matinee. So now, I wanted to speak about sacrifice. What is sacrifice really all about? Like, why did people do it? What did they think they were doing? Okay. The basic idea of sacrifice is, here's the Sanskrit word chakra, which can mean a cycle or a circle or a disc also. Bless you.
Thank you.
It's a chalk. So the idea is that, and I'll use the language of the Bhagavad Gita, because the Bhagavad Gita is sort of like a central text for the Indian tradition. It was considered to be the great synthesis. And the Bhagavad Gita, and we'll talk a lot about the Bhagavad Gita later, but it was a great synthesis of all these different traditions in India. In any case, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna, thousands of years ago, talks about a wheel that has been made to turn, or a cycle that has been made to turn. And that one who does not keep the wheel or the cycle turning lives an offensive life and lives in vain. So the cycle that is being talked about, that you have to keep turning, the wheel you have to keep turning, is that we receive certain gifts from heaven, so to speak. And like, for example, it rains. If it doesn't rain, you can't produce food, right? You can't eat styrofoam or nylon. So it rains, food grows, and then we take this food and offer it back to its source. And that completes a cycle. And if we receive these gifts and don't offer them back, then we are basically considered to be offensive. It's like if you go to a store and take something and don't offer back, you're a shoplifter, you're a criminal. And so in this ancient civilization, they had the same understanding, that the water, the cosmic utilities, the lights, the water, it's not free. Someone is giving that to us, and you have to pay your utility bill. And if you don't pay the utility bill, the light's going to be shut off. In other words, you won't get the sunshine you need, you won't get the rain you need. And so, as much as, that's how we live. I mean, like, you couldn't live in Gainesville if there was no electricity, if there was no water. If there were no basic services, you couldn't live here. So this is what life was all about. These are people who are not alienated. And this system is a world system. You see it in India, but you see it all over the world. Because people lived in nature. It's urban people that live in man-made or human-made environments that begin to believe that reality is sort of like a human construction. It is not a coincidence, by the way, that it's from people who live in cities where your world is all human, crafted by humans, that people start to think that even, let's say, ideas about God are just human inventions, that everything is a human invention. the physical world around us, ideas, everything is relative, everything is human creation. Whereas people who live out in a natural environment, I think, personally, tend to be more in touch with the reality of nature. And if you do a sociological study, you'll find all over the world, where it's America, India, anywhere else, people that tend to live more in the country tend to be more faithful in terms of some kind of religious idea, and people who live in the cities tend to be less so, and tend to be more, to believe in themselves, tend to be more humanistic, because they live in an anthropocentric environment. So anyway, all around the world, people used to feel that you had to complete this cosmic cycle. That's what sacrifice is about. Now there's another point also, which is explained in the Gita, and that is that somehow in the act of offering, you're not merely paying a bill, you are, well, there's one like sort of funny sounding academic word, transmogrify. I'm not going to use it because it sounds too funny, but the idea is that you are actually transforming things, so that if you, let's say you take some water. If you take some water and you offer it to whatever you understand as divine power, a god, a goddess, just, however you relate to divine power. If you offer this water, the water itself is transformed. And so if your offering is accepted, the water actually is ontologically changed. It takes on a different quality. It somehow becomes blessed. It becomes, in every religion, there's the notion of offering and then receiving back some physical substance, something you drink, something you eat, something you put on your body, which has been transformed and somehow has spiritual power in it. And so this was the idea. Now, if you think through this possibility, if it, from a philosophical perspective, if it's actually possible to make an offering and for some type of physical object to ontologically change, to take on a more spiritual nature, it must mean that somehow the thing that you offered, even before you offered, at least potentially was a spiritual object. And so then you start to get into ideas that there's a certain oneness of everything that exists. And that's really the essence of this. We're going to talk a lot about this. The knowledge tradition in ancient India culminated in a very powerful intellectual tradition which came to be called Vedanta. And Anta means end, the end of the Vedas, or the culmination of the Vedas. So we're going to talk a lot about that, about Vedanta. But in any case, I want to, at this point, give you some information about the early form of monotheism, or a type of, a sense of the oneness of everything that exists in the ancient Vedas. They weren't merely doing rituals. So that the people who went out to the forest, the Shramanas, they had material in the Vedas themselves to come to conclusions like that everything is one, or somehow there's one supreme power in the universe apart from the different gods and goddesses to whom we're praying, and so on. So I'll give you some examples of that. Oh. It's a good thing I turned my ringer on. And I'll read you some of the Vedic hymns so you can actually... Gotta see what time it is here. Okay. For example, in the first book of the Rig Veda, and I'll chant the Sanskrit for you, just so you get an idea what it sounds like. This is the oldest existing Sanskrit. There's a statement in the first book, hymn 164. Indram mitram varunam agnimahurato divyaksa suparno garudvan. And here's the punchline. Ekang sadvipra bahutha vadantyagnim jama. And so in matari sana mahu, that it lists all these different gods who are also mentioned, by the way, in ancient documents found in southeastern Europe. Some of these same gods are mentioned, and there's a Mitanni agreement, a truce, a truce, or a treaty. There was a treaty signed between the Hittites, one of your favorite ancient biblical people, the Hittites, who were roughly in central Turkey, and then the Mitanni kingdom, which was in, I guess, roughly now where Lebanon is, northern part of Lebanon. They signed a treaty, and they signed it in the name of these Vedic gods. This is 4,000 years ago at the border of Europe. So anyway, what's said here is that even though there's all these different gods, the truth is actually one. In other words, in the earliest Sanskrit literature in existence, people understood that apart from this polytheism, there is ultimately one truth. The world is not merely polytheistic. And if you know your Plato, in Plato's Republic, he argues against Homer because Homer just talks about polytheism, and Plato says we need to go beyond that to find a single unitary truth. So even in physics, trying to find a great equation, and this intellectual propensity not to be satisfied simply with a bunch of stuff. How do we clean this up? What's the underlying principle? What's the ultimate equation, the ultimate term which explains all this? So they said there's actually one supreme truth which the sages call in different ways. And as one philosopher of Indian philosophies puts it, Indian monotheism in its living forms from the Vedic age till now has believed rather in the unity of gods in God rather than the denial of gods for God. In other words, rather than saying that to show our loyalty to God, we deny all the other gods, which is something you start to find in people like Paul of Tarsus, that they're all dead gods, we have the living God, and all that. Actually, even in the Old Testament, the very first commandment is you shall have no other God before me. It doesn't say the gods don't exist. It just says you have to get them in the right order. And actually, if you read the Old Testament carefully, if you talk to Old Testament scholars, there are lists of different gods in the Old Testament. And the first commandment is to get them in the right order, not to prioritize another god over the God of Israel. You shall have no other gods before me. It doesn't say they don't exist. And similarly, in this conception, it's like if you have a supreme leader, and then under that supreme leader are various subordinates. So the idea is that in the kingdom of God, in this conception, there are many souls like us who have achieved higher positions to assist in the administration of the universe. But there's one supreme God. So it's not a denial of the gods as like proving your love for the one God, but rather it's the unity of the gods within a supreme God with a capital G. So that's a conception we get here. And then it gets more specific. It gets more specific. Very early on, in the earliest Vedas, there is a tendency to identify Vishnu, who later comes to be called Krishna, the author of the Bhagavad Gita. There's a tendency to identify Vishnu as that supreme God. So I'll just give you a few statements from the Vedas to substantiate that. For example, in the Taittiriya Samhita, there are 4 Vedas. I've said that. And the name of each Veda explains what it is. So Rig means hymn. So the Rig Veda is the hymn Veda. Yajur, obviously connected to the word yajna, sacrifice. The Yajur Veda is the ancient Veda that explains what the sacrifice is. What is its meaning? Why do we do it? And so on. So the Taittiriya Samhita is one of the versions of the Yajur Veda. And we find this statement. Vishnu Yajno. That Vishnu is the sacrifice. Again, the sacrifice, the idea was creates a spiritual field so that anything offered into that spiritual field becomes transformed. And in the Vedas, people start to conclude that actually the sacrifice somehow is God, is Vishnu, in the sense that when we do the sacrifice, we are coming into a spiritual space. And so somehow the entire atmosphere of the sacrifice is somehow an extension of the holiness of God. That was the idea. So therefore you find the statement that Yagyo by Vishnu, Vishnu Yagyo. Vishnu is the sacrifice. And Agni Ravamo Devatanam Vishnu Paramo. That Agni, fire, obviously like our English word ignite, Agni. So Agni, the god of fire, is the lowest of the gods, the highest is Vishnu. So this is not merely polytheism. And this is going all the way back to the early Vedas. Then you have a statement in the, as I said, each one of the 4 Vedas has its Brahmanas. So if you imagine, say these are the 4 Vedas, the Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Sama Veda, and Atharva Veda. These are the 4 Vedas. Then each one has its own Brahman literature, and each one has its own Aranyakas, etc. Each one has its own Upanishads. So all these later classes of literature come down in different Vedic schools. So the Rig Veda is the oldest Veda, and sort of the basis of the others. The oldest Brahmana literature, which is the commentary in the Rig Veda, is called the Aitareya Brahmana. What's significant is this is by far the oldest commentary on the oldest Vedic literature, going back thousands and thousands of years. And the very first statement of this oldest commentary, of the oldest Vedic literature, the very first statement is, da-da-da, Agnirvai Devanam Avamo Vishnu Paramastarantarena Sarvanya Devata, which means that of all the gods, Vishnu is the highest. And again, poor Agni came in last again. And then in between Vishnu and Agni are all the other gods. Yes?
Does the Vedas place Vishnu over Brahma? Or does he
the creator Brahma.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. The creator Brahma never really was worshipped that much. Somehow, I don't know, just sort of the creator that couldn't. I mean, in terms, he never really became a great god of religion. He was always a figure that just sort of like the demiurgos in Plato. It's like he sort of explained the creation. He never really became a prominent figure of religious worship. Yes?
I feel like it's because people fear Vishnu as the destroyer, right? Or
No, that's Shiva.
He said is the sustainer.
Yeah, sustainer. Yeah, Vishnu.
Like it's more essential than the creation. As you know.
The idea is that we talk about three modes: goodness, passion, and ignorance. The idea is that creation was considered a passionate act, and destruction was considered an ignorant act in the sense of destroying things. Shiva, in the early Vedas, who's called Rudra there, is considered sort of a dangerous figure, someone you have to placate so he doesn't mess you up. Whereas Vishnu, because he was in maintenance, like just to maintain the world, was considered an act of goodness, and therefore Vishnu was always the Brahmana Devata. He was the god of the Brahmins. And there's a very famous visual image of Brahma being born out of Vishnu. So the idea was, so Brahma early on came to be seen as a creation of Vishnu. Yes?
I have one more question. There's this one story where they said Brahma and Vishnu appear, and then there's
there are
planting a pillar.
thousands of stories.
But that one claims that Shiva is like the highest.
I know, there are lots of stories. But here I'm going back to the Vedas. I mean, later on, that's coming from a later period of Hinduism, where there's a proliferation of texts, all kinds of like Puranas and Agama literature, and then we'll talk about that. And different groups start to make claims for their deities. But here I'm going back to the oldest literature. So, anyway, there's so many, I could give you all these quotes, the Shatapata Brahmana, Te Yajnameva Vishnu Puras Krityeyu, placing Vishnu at the head, the gods preceded, and so on. Now there's another thing, one more thing I want to mention here, which is very important in terms of the earliest form of monotheism or theism in the Vedas. And that is in the 10th book, the last book of the Rig Veda. There's perhaps the most famous hymn of the Rig Veda called the Purusha Sukta. I don't know if that's mentioned in your book. Purusha means literally the person, and it often comes to mean like the supreme person, the high God. And so the Sukta means the hymn. So this is in the 10th book of the Rig Veda, 90th hymn, 1090, and I'll just read you some of it. First, the Sanskrit verses 2 and 3, which are very interesting. Purusharevedam sarvam jat bhutam yachat bhavyam utamritatvasyeishano jaranenati rohati etavanasya mahimato jayang cha purusha padosya vishwabhutani tripadasyaamritam divi. So what this means is that that the Purusha, or this personal deity, is all that exists, and all that will come to be, and all that was. And this Purusha is immortal, and that this entire material world, whatever is there in this universe, is only 1/4 of the extension of that Purusha, and that 3/4 of the creation of God is actually on the spiritual plane. So there's a conception that this whole world is just a fraction of the entire creation of God. And this is, of course, in the Rig Veda, and you have other statements in the Rig Veda about Vishnu. Here's the most famous one, probably. Tad Vishnu paramang padang sada pashanti suraya, that all the godly people are always gazing toward that supreme place of Vishnu. So the notion of a spiritual world, the notion of a transcendent deity, the notion that that transcendent deity is the world in some way. that there's a oneness of everything. So that it's not a creation from nothing. It's not a dualism where here you have God and then God creates the world, but there's this gulf of separation between God and the world. When we start to talk about Vedanta and get into the really heavy philosophical debates that went on about this, basically the debate will center on trying to figure out what is the relationship between God and the world, between God and ourselves. And this is how the Indian tradition, the Vedic, Hindu tradition, even the Buddhist tradition, they all jump into this. Basically, they take statements like this, that there's a supreme person, and that the varnas, the social orders, come from that Purusha, from that supreme person. And what else? Something else came out of it, I forgot. Oh yeah, the Vedas. The Vedas also came out, and everything, the entire world came out of that Purusha is the source of everything. So later we'll get to the Vedanta, and the Vedanta will begin with the statement, Atato Brahma Jigyasa. We have to understand the absolute, and the absolute is defined as Janmadya Siddhata, the source of everything. So all these things come together, the absolute, God, the source of everything, and that God being the source of everything somehow is everything. As we'll learn, this is based on a philosophical doctrine called Satkaryavad, which means that an effect is present in its cause. In other words, let's say you have well, not you, but let's say there's a fender bender on the road, a little accident. Insurance adjusters come out, and they, if possible, they say, don't move the cars, say the skid marks and all that. And so they start with the effect. They start with the effect and try to reason back to the cause. Now, if you can reason back from effect to cause, it means that somehow cause is present in the effect, right? Let's say you're doing medical research, and you start with an effect, a disease, and you reason back to the cause. Let's say you're a historian, and you start with an effect, say World War I. And then you say, why did World War I happen? So in general, every type of analysis goes chronologically in reverse, because things interest us. And whatever interests us, whatever we're trying to understand, had a cause. So you start with that effect and try to reason back to the cause. And so this is called in Sanskrit Satkaryavad. So if this world is an effect, and if we study this world, we can reason our way back to the cause, namely the source, or God. By the way, this was also a very popular view with the rise of science in Europe. If you look at the Age of Reason in the 17th century and so on, it became very popular to say that God has given us two books. God has revealed two books. One book is the Bible. The other book is the book of nature. And so there was a very enthusiastic, powerful movement in European intellectual history of what they call natural philosophy or natural theology. The idea that if you study nature, if you study the effect, you can reason your way back to the cause. And so because the cause is somehow present in the effect, therefore people came to the conclusion that there is some kind of oneness of all that exists. If there is a source of everything, if everything comes from a single supreme source, there is some kind of oneness of all things. And if there is, then we ourselves are somehow one with the source of our existence. So, therefore, what is precisely the relationship between the source and physical nature, ourselves as souls? Because are we God? Is the oneness absolute in the sense that we just are God? We are the source of ourselves? Or can we be one with God, and yet God is somehow different from us? And of course the Buddhists will come in and say, no, you got it all wrong, don't even talk about souls and God. So, but everyone's going to get into this debate. And it's all coming from this very early Vedic language, the Purusha Sukta. And very early on, people will start to identify the Purusha as Vishnu, that the Purusha actually is Vishnu. In fact, the Shatapatha Brahmana, a very ancient Sanskrit text, Vedic text, you have the simple statement, Purusho ha Narayana. The Purusha is Narayana, which is the name of Vishnu. So, so what we see here, and here in other places in the Vedas, that even in this ritual literature, the earliest Vedas, you find the seeds of later philosophical speculations, the seed of later theisms, which we'll talk about in India, because Hinduism, that's a whole thing. We'll talk about Hinduism. Like, anyway, so we have this, so basically this is what's happening historically. We have this Vedic culture existing. Within the culture, there are obviously different dynamic tensions going on. Some people are not satisfied with the ritual culture, the violence of the sacrifice, what they consider to be the materialism and the superficiality of just performing rituals to get material goods. They want knowledge, they want self-purification, they want enlightenment. Some of those people stay within the Vedic culture and develop this whole Vedanta and Upanishad culture, yoga culture. Some people bail, they leave the Vedic culture and they start other religions like Jainism and Buddhism. And there is this tremendous tension. It becomes a conflict, not military most of the time, but just debating, fighting for the hearts and minds of souls. And so as a result of this tension, this conflict, something new emerges, which, roughly speaking, you could call Hinduism. So one last point, there's another, the most prominent literature of Hinduism, which we'll talk about in the future, literature called like the Puranas. We'll talk about this a lot later, which means ancient stories, Itihasa, histories, Mahabharata, Ramayana, the story of Krishna, the story of Rama. And these really become the heart of Hinduism. Often you'll see chronologies in textbooks where first you have this earlier literature and then later you get these stories. But actually, in the Vedic literature itself, in one of the oldest of the Upanishads, called the Chandogya Upanishad, you have a statement that Itihasa Puranam Cha Panchamo Veda Uchate, that the Itihasa, the histories, and the Puranas, all these stories that become the heart of later Hinduism, are the fifth Veda. So that means they already existed back in the Vedic age. But they were mostly oral traditions. So while all this is going on, you have to remember there are oral traditions going on. People are telling stories. It's an extremely rich, diverse culture. All kinds of things are going on simultaneously. But everyone kind of agrees on the need to pay the cosmic utility bill. So everyone accepts the basic necessity of sacrifice. And there's a general interest in the oneness of the universe and a growing interest in personal enlightenment and in ethical issues like nonviolence, ahimsa. Maybe we shouldn't be killing all these animals in sacrifice, and so on. So Wednesday we will, did I leave out anything? I think that's basically what I... So Wednesday we'll talk about one of the breakaway religions, Jainism. So have a nice... yeah, so Wednesday. And if anyone wants your homework back, it's over on the side table here.